Hi, Alisi, welcome.
Hi, Heidi.
How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. We were just discussing earlier about the weather. Dealing with the winter in Canada, nothing too outrageous. How about yourself? Tell us where
Yeah,
you're at.
yeah, in Berlin, we just had some snow, and yeah, it's already an extreme temperature for people here. Only -10.
Right, right. So, maybe let's just start by a quick introduction. Like, tell us what your art is. You do short films, but they're also multimedia. So maybe let's start with that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a Canadian artist of Mongolian origin, and I was based in Montreal, and I moved to Berlin about a year ago. Yeah. So I do animated short films mostly. Yeah.
Excellent. So I know that we have a Toronto connection with the Toronto Animated uh, Society. Is that right?
Yeah, Toronto Animated Image Society.
Image
Yeah,
Society.
I
Yeah.
finished my film there actually. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Which film is that?
It's called The FOURFOLD. It just screened at Sundance this year in January 2021. So I was animating at Toronto Animate Image Society. Yeah, Thais. I was
Mhm.
working there last summer. Yeah, I mean
Oh,
2019 summer for 3, 4 months. Yeah.
oh, that's great. I wasn't sure which film you had finished there, so I'm glad that I asked you that. So I did want to talk to you about the Fourfold because it is the short film that I was able to watch at Sundance, and it really is quite, in my opinion, innovative in the way that you're using your technique. And I've heard you speak about your film already. You've done a few interviews, so I'm grateful for that information. I know that you are somebody who's inspired by a couple of artists who create their animation under the camera. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so can you maybe speak about how that evolved, how you decided that one, this is the film that you want to make, and two, sort of the elements that you want to include in the film?
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's an under camera technique and workflow. I was inspired, I was an animation student in Montreal. I was inspired by the works by the South African artist William Cantridge, and I saw his work because he did this huge drawing animation, and everything was drawn on the same single piece of paper. You could see the traces of labor.
Mm-hmm.
So wow, look at it, was like, wow, that's very I was very intrigued by this kind of workflow. So I started using some tests like with colors and oil pastel, different materials. At the beginning, it wasn't working, but finally it started working. And so I continued working with the same kind of technique every time with some different materials. So yeah, so that's the under camera technique. Yeah, it's basically a time lapse photography of painting in my
Mm-hmm.
case.
Excellent. And before I get into the story of the Fourfold, can you maybe talk a little bit about the technical aspects? Because it is so labor intensive and it is time lapse. How long would a project like the Fourfold take, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I was working part-time, started from 2018. At the same time, I was working on another stop motion film that will come out soon this year.
Yeah.
So I would say part-time took me 2 years. But when I was at Thais, I was working full-time.
Mm-hmm.
I was there. I mean, I'm so glad there are some residencies that help independent animation artists who want to make a project, who finish a project. So I was very fortunate to have this a few 3, 4 months to just work on this project. I was really happy.
So that was towards the end of the project that you were doing full time?
Yeah, exactly. So I really left Montreal and I was in Toronto in this studio space. I worked there. Yeah.
Great. So in the Fourfold, you are talking about I'm just going to bring up the themes that you're discussing. I appreciated that your grandmother was part of this and she was sharing a lot of stories that you probably grew up listening to, our connection to nature, our connection to, the world in general. So can you talk about the themes, but also the sort of the elements that you used in your art, because it's mixed media, which I really appreciated.
Oh, thank you. So in the film, it's not just painting, but I also incorporated some textural materials and plants, real plants, because the film is about this animistic beliefs and shamanic rituals from Mongolia and Siberia. And I heard about all these rituals as a child from my grandparents, because they used to live as Mongolian nomads on the grassland. So they told me lots of their wisdom and what they lived through. And then so I was a kid, I heard about that. But then when I grew up, I learned that all of these rituals were called animism by a British anthropologist. But this term is of colonialist ascription. And then it was Longshan in the 19th century, because he was kind of, by this anthropologist, he's kind of saying that Western European has advanced to the highest stage of science, while the rest of the people were still primitive or animistic. Because for him, animism is about, for example, trees and stones and mountains, even the entire cosmos is alive. Is considered as a person. In this way, human just have respect with nature, and then you are all human is part of nature, and then everything's together. So by this anthropologist idea was Longshan, and then it's very interesting. Started from about 20 years ago, there's this huge movement by indigenous populations around the world. They started to call themselves animistic, because they use this term to protect, for example, for land rights and the protection of natural resources and environmental ethics. So I'm so glad so that's kind of my message and my inspiration.
Which makes sense, but right, because it's stuff that we've grown up hearing in our cultures, and it's also kind of come back full circle. This reclaiming of the words that were used to make people less than others. And it's now this sort of it's kind of become more of like a power shift, I think. In language, right? And creating these movements. I'm just curious, how old is your grandmother?
She's 85 now. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I love hearing her voice, because you can almost envision, somebody like my own grandmother, for example. Can you talk to me about working with her, because she's sort of a knowledge keeper, I would say, in our culture and in your culture. So what was that like? How did you approach her to talk about this and record her? What was that experience like?
Yeah, sure. So I would say it's more like oral traditions. It's present in many cultures around the world. So many things like stories and many history, they're perceived not exactly like linear, like a history book, like from A to Z. But I think oral history, there are lots of like emotions or non-linear storytelling. So I like that aspect. And then when I talked to my grandmother, I asked her, I want to ask, like, could you tell me this again? And it's interesting, because I asked her, and then we did the recording, and then she forgot some elements, and then we have to do it again. But it was, we did a few practices, and then, So, and then later there was some editing of the sound as well.
Right. Was she aware what you were doing with the recording, that you were going to do this short film?
She said she knows that it's going to be a project and an animated short film, but she has no idea how it's going to look like, because she always finds my projects very abstract.
And that's okay, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the fun and the interesting aspects of animation, that it could be abstract, but we can interpret it in our own ways, and we do get your message across, but then it becomes sort of our own interpretation of that as well.
Yeah, exactly. And also in indigenous cultures or outside of this Euro-Western world, I think lots of animation, they're not super hyper realistic, like 3D and super clean looking. There's lots of like this handcraftedness embedded in this indigenous culture, for example, like weaving and then like making carpets, etc. There are lots of like handmade, and it's always made by a woman as well, always made by hand. So I like this connection.
Excellent. So you mentioned a little bit about the sound as well. Can you talk about incorporating the different sounds and the music, which I know it's from, I think it's a Siberian group, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Besides my grandmother's voice, there's a song featured called Wave. It's a collaboration between this indigenous group called Hunhurtu. They are in Tuva, Siberia. It's like right beside Mongolia. Yeah. So they do this throat singing. They also use some traditional musical instruments called murinhur. So yeah, they did a collaboration with a female vocal, like female choir group from Bulgaria. So that's the song that was featured in the film. And I think I like the fact that they have many layers, not just like throat singing, musical instrument. Also, the female's choir also has many layers, just like on the mountains. Yeah,
Yeah,
like the echoes.
yeah, it fit to the visuals quite well, I think.
Oh, thank you.
What other sound design did you do for the film?
Oh, there are lots of sound of nature. For example, trees and moving icebergs and like forest sound. Lots of ambience and sound effects of nature in the soundtracks.
Were those added? I guess. Did you work with someone in terms of doing the sound design as well?
Oh no, I did the sound design, but I was very fortunate that I worked with very experienced sound designer, and he did something very interesting. He's supposed to be do the sound design usually, but he did the sound mix for my project. So I think that really helped.
That's great. So you
Olivier.
Also...
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, Olivier Calvert. Yeah, that's his name. Yeah.
Thank you. I was going to ask, so you've also learned the other side of in filmmaking, I guess, which is also this technical sound design aspect.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, sound design. It's quite different, but at the same time, it's technical, but at the same time, it's very intuitive. Yeah, I found it very interesting.
Yeah, I'm curious as an artist because in this film you were quite involved, how that makes you sort of create, in the sense that you're doing more than one thing. You're animating, you're sort of adding sounds, you're connecting to family. What's that experience like, and what would you say you've learned from this?
I would say that's kind of normal for independent animation, because usually in the festival you see an independent animation film, then in the credits you just see multiple tasks made by one person. I just think that it's quite normal for animation projects. Yeah. And for me, I learned that I think it's great that I have this creative control, but I have to do multitasking. Like, it's true that I have all the creative control, but it will be interesting sometimes to collaborate with others as well. Yeah.
So you would see that you'd also, like you mentioned, you have another project coming up, which is, I guess, more of a collaboration in a bigger team.
Oh yeah, that one is a project that I worked for the first time with a big team.
Great.
It's a very different process.
Do you have a preference for either one, or do you like them both?
I think I would definitely continue working on my own project, definitely. And then probably I will do some collaborative projects too, but I will keep doing what I've been doing. Yeah.
So I know that you've done a lot of interviews and discussion around the FOURFOLD for Sundance. Have you had any reactions that surprised you or that you found quite interesting?
Yeah, actually, it's not just from Sundance. I had some screenings even before Sundance. I just found it so interesting that I got the feedback. For example, people in Brazil or people in Italy, they would say, we have something similar. We also have this tradition. Then they would tell me we have this, or they have this deity, and they also had this ancient tradition, or they heard something from their grandmother. I just found it so interesting that people from very different cultures and very different regions of the world, but they have things in common. That's I found very interesting.
I think it's also great because it connects to your film so well, right? This idea of the idea of being connected, right? I mean, us as humans, but also with our world not just our immediate world, but the bigger world. And like you said, the cosmos, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice to see that the message translates, I think.
Yeah, and also I think that there are lots of things in common among indigenous peoples, so that's very interesting too.
Absolutely. And I think it's also good to see and hear that, you know, like you were saying, we have this Eurocentric way of looking at the world, that there are these other views that are not Eurocentric that are actually quite popular across the world, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask something about you, just going back in time a little bit. I heard that you wanted to be a painter initially.
Yeah.
Aside from your short films, do you still practice painting?
Yeah, I started a little bit. Actually, I had an exhibition in the summer of 2020. So that was my first exhibition of paintings. I never, because you know, in my animations, kind of the paintings being destroyed because everything was painted on the same surface. It's a straight ahead, the current straight ahead momentum. So at the end, basically the final image of the animation, which is the artwork, is the last image of the film, which is there's nothing left, which is the background, the credits, end credits.
Right.
So it's very interesting for me to make paintings, and then that is framed. For me, it's quite new, actually.
Right, because it's also like you said, it's this idea of time where you know, in the animation process, you are kind of working kind of along or with time, and with when it comes to painting, it's almost like static, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I really did like, just speaking about painting, I really like that aspect of your short film, in the sense that you could tell the layers of paint. It was so tactile, and the way that you moved the paint as well across. What did you use? Was it wood or paper?
It's oil pastel on one piece of paper, so the background was always the same. And then I carried it from Montreal to Toronto.
Okay. So I ask these questions because one, I'm just curious about the process, but I think other people, sometimes we see the finished product, which is a short film or even a feature film, and we don't really we don't always get to hear what happens behind the scenes. So I thank you for sharing all these details, because I find them very interesting. Is there anything in the story that your grandmother told you, something that still surprises you or amazes you in terms of, you know, the beliefs and the rituals of your culture?
Yeah, I didn't know that the fire ritual happens on December 23rd. I didn't know that. I just know that happens sometime in winter. And then in the interview, she said, "Oh, it's December 23rd." I was like, okay.
That's interesting. I'm from Latin America, and in Guatemala, we have like this burning thing that they do. I think it's December 7th.
Wow.
But it's not to a god per se, but it's just more like you burn sort of the negativity of the year, right? And there's some paganisms attached to it, but I don't know the story very well. But I found that interesting that it just happens to be in December as well. And I don't know if it's a calendar thing or you know, but again, it's just this connection of stories and rituals that kind of transcend language and culture, right?
Yeah. And also it's like, as you mentioned, it's like kind of, it's a different way of how humans relate to nature outside of this Eurocentric point of view since modernity, since the, I don't know, since 16th century. So
very true. I'm curious as to what is next for you. What are you working on? I know you mentioned the collaboration. What are you working on now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm supposed to go to near Lake Baikal. It's the largest freshwater lake in the world. It's drinkable water. It's in Siberia. So I'm supposed to go there to do some interviews, to do some field research for my next project. But because of the pandemic, I don't think I could go in the foreseeable future. So I started some animation, and maybe I will do the interview online, or maybe there's no more voice. I will see. Yeah.
So is this an idea that you want to pursue? You want to be working in that sort of side of the world just to learn more?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things to learn from indigenous people. And this animistic idea is very, that's my focus for now. I think it's very interesting. And also it's very important in this time of climate change and this kind of human-induced rapid environmental change, because the animistic idea is you consider human and other person. I mean, the other person means like nature, stone, trees, like all together, and then you have respect for other. So I think it's a very important message in our time.
Yeah, I think it's great because it is a very common thread, like I mentioned, in different discourses. And even in, we have even young activists like Thunberg. So I think the time is kind of ripe, or for people to listen to these kinds of stories, even though to us, we've been told their stories, but they're also quite unique and true beliefs, I guess, in the sense of our impact on the world and nature. So I'm curious to see what's coming from you next. For people who want to follow your journey in terms of your work, where can we find you?
Where can I find
your website? Is there a website?
Oh yeah, I have a website and I have a Vimeo and Instagram. Yeah.
And they're all under your name, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is thank you so much for speaking with me, Alisi.
Thank you.
It's really, really refreshing to hear your point of view, and I'm looking forward to seeing your next work. I will put the website and the other social media links for people to follow you. And please stay safe.
Oh, stay safe. Thank you so much.